Jeff says he's glad to have me with him. It took him 20 years to persuade me to come with him and talk. I'm kind of a reluctant speaker. So.
As Monday morning came after Easter Sunday, we wrapped up to head back home.
Easter is kind of a special time of year for a lot of people in a lot of different religious tradition and cultures, and it was a special time for me. Jeff kind of remembers a lot of this in a big fog, and when he finally persuaded me to start talking about this, and I wrote it in a book, I went back and looked at my journal, because I've kept a daily journal for the last 40 years almost. And so we were able to put some dates to some of these things. And interestingly enough, while he's getting ready to make this trip back home on this weekend, I looked in my journal, and maybe it's coincidence, but maybe not, based on what Jeff said about coincidences. I was fasting for spiritual reasons, and I was teaching a group about becoming one with the universe, one with God, and finding a place and a connection with the divine, which I thought was an interesting sequence of events that was happening simultaneous in our lives, though we'd never met.
But yeah, I was going 75 miles an hour, and I believe what happened is I dozed off at the wheel for just a minute. Now, there was a profound moment before that time stood still. I was just glancing to look at traffic. And as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I happened to see my little toddler. You know, it's a moment, but sometimes a moment can be like eternity. I just glanced, and there he was in the back seat. And he had fallen fast asleep. He was fast asleep in his car seat, and I just noticed details about him. I noticed how long his eyelashes were. I noticed Spencer playing in the back seat behind me. He had action figures he got in his Easter basket. And then I just glanced at Tamra, and she was still holding on to my hand. So I'm driving with this hand. She's holding on to my right hand. And I had this moment of absolute gratitude. I thought, she's been married to me for 10 years. 2 kids later, and here she is still holding my hand. You know, the same way she did when I had a couple extra dollars in my pocket and took her to the dollar movie in college. I was a broke college student. But in that moment, it stood still, and I was overcome with gratitude. 2 things: her running to say goodbye, and then seeing what was around me, and then racing up the road. And it was an hour after that it all went haywire. That's when I believed I dozed off. Holding her hand, I swerved to the right, I overcorrected to the left, and I lost control of the car. And the car began to roll. Not off the road, but down the road, propelled by the concrete. And I blacked out for most of that. The first thing I heard when I realized, oh my goodness, we've crashed, I heard my 7-year-old crying hysterically in the back seat. And I thought, I've got to get to him. I've got to get to him. I was unaware of my own injuries. What had actually happened is both of my legs had been crushed and banged up and shattered. My left leg was amputated above the knee. I wear a prosthetic to walk. My back had been broken in a couple of places, but the spinal column wasn't damaged. My rib cage was damaged. My lungs were collapsing. My right arm had almost been pulled off, and then the seatbelt had cut through me and ruptured all my insides. I had no idea. All I knew is that my son was crying. I had to get to my little boy. But that's when I realized no one else was crying. That was the brutal reality that Tamra and Griffin were gone. And I don't share that to be graphic or morbid, but it was the worst hell a man could be in. And it was in that darkest moment that light came. And I say that, and I didn't experience a tunnel. I was in the worst nightmare I'll ever know. and it felt like light came to me. Suddenly I was surrounded by light, and it felt like it was love, like it was comforting me in this brutal moment. And I began to rise above the scene of the accident, as if I was just rising out of it. And I thought, wow, I can breathe. Oh, I don't hurt. Am I okay? That was my question. Am I okay? And then I realized that Tamra, who I knew was deceased at the scene, and I won't go into details about that, but I knew she was gone because she had laid her seat back. The seatbelt had not restrained her properly, and she had experienced some pretty severe head trauma. That's what took her life. But in this light, suddenly there she was, and she was beautiful, and she was okay. So I was thinking, I'm okay, and she's okay. But she kept saying, you've got to go back, you've got to go back.
Before Jeff arrived, we knew a lot about what had happened. We knew that his wife was deceased at the scene and that his 14-month-old son, Griffin, was deceased at the scene. It was a room about, 20 by 30 feet and had an elevated ceiling with an observation area for teaching purposes. And as I entered the room, I looked across, and standing in the air about 6 feet above the gurney was Tamra, Jeff's wife, deceased wife. Observing his care and expressing her profound gratitude for what the team was doing. And she communicated with me without using words.
And it was this, it turned into this trusting, open friendship where we could share anything. And when he said to me, when did you become a god? The interesting thing, based on my experience, I said, I always have been, and so are you. We all are. We all are the divine. There is no difference. I mean, when I was in the arms of the divine and felt that, what I felt was, I am that I am. Oh, I am that I am? And if I am that I am, then you are that I am. We are all of it.
On this first day that he was healthy enough to be in his brother's home and I came to visit him, he proceeded to tell me about one of his experiences that he had in the hospital, not long before he was able to leave the hospital. And it had to do with his other son, Griffin, the 14-month-old boy who died at the scene. And in this experience, Jeff, he didn't remember actually telling this to me. He didn't believe that he had told this to me until I showed him where I'd written it in my journal that day. He was given an opportunity to hold Griffin again, to see him. And although it was a spiritual experience, it was profoundly real and tactile. And in fact, he told me at the time that he was holding his son, he was impressed with how he was having these physical feelings of holding his boy. He was given the opportunity to make the choice to give Griffin back. In some inexplicable cosmic chronology, even though the event had already taken place, there was something in this divine timeline that he was able to go back and make a choice to willingly give his son back to some divine being that from whence he came.
I mean, there I was, and there was two profound things. Here I am holding my little boy, who had been toddling around and slobbering and calling Easter eggs balls. And yet when those divine arms wrapped around me and we became the divine, it was like, wow, the way I see my little boy and how perfect he is, that's the way the divine sees all of us. Dr. O'Driscoll became my validator. I was having these profound spiritual things that were very personal, and then he would show up and somehow verify them. In the very beginning, with Tamra appearing in the trauma room.
And I've read a lot of ancient texts. I've read the Bhagavad Gita of the Hindus. I've studied the Quran more than most of my Muslim friends. I learned Hebrew so that I could study the Torah in Hebrew. And I've read the New Testament many times. And this notion about being gods, I mean, the Pharisees accused Christ of blasphemy for saying that he was a son of God. And his response to these people who wanted to kill him was, "Ye are gods. Is it not written in your law, I have said, ye are gods?" He was quoting the 82nd Psalm. He wasn't coming up with some new Christian doctrine. He was quoting Scripture that they already accepted as being ancient and true. And he was telling these people who wanted to murder him, "You're gods." So, yes, it sounds blasphemous sometimes when you say these kind of things, but if you look at the ancient texts in a lot of different cultures, and if you have experiences of your own, you begin to realize that people are divine.